There are fates worse than death. History knows this. But what happened beneath the stone floors of the palace in 1473 goes beyond anything most people can imagine. It wasn't a massacre. It wasn't a public execution. It was something far more deliberate, far more cruel. And for decades, the Ottoman Empire made sure no one would ever know. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Christian world watched in horror as the Byzantine Empire breathed its last. Churches were converted, treasures were looted, but the soldiers didn't stop at symbols. They went after souls. And among the first targets were the women who had devoted their lives to God. Nuns, cloistered, protected, untouchable under Byzantine law, until they weren't. On a cold morning in April of 1473, Ottoman soldiers surrounded the convent of the Holy Ascension on the outskirts of the city. 22 women lived there. The youngest was barely 16. The oldest, 71, they had no weapons, no defenses, just prayers and the walls they believed would protect them. The soldiers didn't knock. They shattered the doors with axes. Inside, the nuns gathered in the chapel, kneeling before the altar as the sound of boots echoed closer. Sister the abbess stood at the front with her arms outstretched. She believed God would intervene. He didn't. The soldiers bound their wrists with rope and dragged them into the courtyard. Some struggled, others went silent. One nun, barely more than a girl, screamed for her mother until a guard struck her across the face. Blood pooled in the dirt. The convent was burned that same day, not to destroy it, but to erase it, to send a message that this place, these women, had never existed. And as the flames consumed the stone walls, the nuns were loaded into carts and taken toward the palace. They thought they were going to die. They were wrong. The palace was a city within a city. Endless corridors, hidden chambers, gardens that stretched toward but beneath it all, buried deep under marble and gold, were the forgotten spaces. Storage rooms, old dungeons, tunnels that dated back to Byzantine times. And it was here in the belly of the empire that the nuns were brought. They were stripped of their habits. Their crosses were torn from their necks and melted down. Their heads were shaved, not for hygiene, for humiliation. To break them before the real work began. The first test came within hours. They were separated into small groups and locked in different chambers. No light, no food, just stone walls and the sound of their own breathing. Then came the voice. A man they never saw, speaking through a crack in the door, calm, patient, almost kind. He asked one question. "Will you renounce your faith?" Silence. He asked again. Still silence. Then he left, and the waiting began. Days passed, maybe weeks. Time lost meaning in the dark. Hunger became a constant companion. Thirst turned their mouths to sand. Some wept, others prayed. A few screamed until their voices gave out. But the voice returned, always the same question, always the same answer, silence. This was not torture in the traditional sense. There were no blades, no flames, just deprivation, just the slow erosion of the human spirit. And it worked. On the 8th day, one of the younger nuns whispered the words. She renounced Christ. The door opened. She was taken away, dressed in silk, fed, bathed, and never seen again. The others heard her footsteps fade down the corridor, and they understood. This wasn't about conversion. It was about breaking them, about proving that faith, no matter how strong, could be stripped away piece by piece. Sister Theodora, who had been with the convent for 30 years, wept that night, not for the girl who had broken, but for what awaited the rest of them. The ones who remained were moved deeper into the palace, into chambers that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. The air was thick with mold and the smell of damp stone, rats in the corners, and somewhere far above, life continued. Courtiers laughed, musicians played, fountains flowed. But down here in the forgotten places, 21 women existed in a kind of living death. The guards began a new method, isolation within isolation. Each nun was kept alone for days at a time. No human contact, no sound except the drip of water somewhere in the dark. Then, without warning, they would be brought together into a single room, just long enough to see each other's faces, to see how much weight had been lost, how hollow the eyes had become. Then they were separated again. This cycle repeated endlessly, connection and severance, hope and despair. It was psychological warfare, refined to an art. Sister Magdalena, who had once been strong enough to carry water for the entire convent, now struggled to stand. Her hands shook. Her voice was barely a whisper. But when the guards came to question her, she looked them in the eye and said nothing. Not a word, not a sound. Her silence became her weapon, and slowly the others followed her example. They stopped responding entirely. When asked their names, they stared ahead. When offered food in exchange for a simple phrase of submission, they turned away. The guards grew frustrated, then angry, then afraid. There was something unnatural about their stillness, something that unnerved even the hardest men. One guard later told a story that spread through the lower ranks. He had been sent to check on the women in the middle of the night. When he opened the door, he found them sitting in a circle, eyes closed, completely silent, but the air in the room was freezing. His breath came out in clouds, and for just a moment he swore he heard singing, faint, distant, in a language he didn't recognize. He slammed the door and refused to return. The empire had a problem. These women were supposed to break. They were supposed to serve as proof that Christian faith was weak, that Islam was stronger, but instead they had become symbols of something the Ottomans couldn't control. Endurance, defiance, faith that refused to die no matter how deeply it was buried. So a decision was made: if they wouldn't convert, they would simply cease to exist, not through execution. That would create martyrs, but through erasure. The records would show nothing. No names. No deaths, just a blank space where 21 souls had once been. By the winter of 1474, 11 of the original 22 were still alive. The others had succumbed to starvation, illness, or simply the will to give up. But those who remained grew stranger, calmer, as if they had passed through suffering and come out the other side into something else entirely. The servants who brought what little food was allowed began to fear them. They moved too slowly, spoke too softly, and their eyes, sunken and dark, seemed to see through walls. One night, a young servant girl made a mistake. She left a candle burning near one of the chambers. When she returned hours later to retrieve it, she found something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Through a crack in the door, she saw the nuns gathered in a circle. They had arranged broken pottery shards into the shape of a cross, and they were kneeling, praying, in complete silence. Their lips moved, but no sound came out. It was as if they had learned to worship in a way that transcended voice, in a way that couldn't be stopped or stolen. The girl reported what she had seen. The guards searched the chamber and found the makeshift altar. They destroyed it, scattered the pottery. But the next night it was there again, built from new scraps, new fragments. The guards destroyed it again, and again it returned. This continued for weeks, until finally the guards gave up. They sealed the chamber from the outside and posted no one to watch it. Let them pray to their God in the dark. Let them fade into nothing, out of sight, out of history. But the nuns didn't fade. They found something in that darkness, something the empire couldn't touch. Deep within the labyrinth of corridors beneath the palace, they discovered an old passage, a forgotten archway sealed with loose stones. Behind it was a small room, barely large enough for all of them to fit, but it became sacred. They cleared the dust. They used scraps of cloth to clean the walls, and with shards of broken glass and pieces of charcoal, they began to carve crosses, prayers, names of the sisters who had died. Each mark was an act of rebellion, a refusal to be forgotten. And in that hidden chapel they gathered every night after the palace above had gone silent. No hymns, no sermons, just the act of being together, of remembering who they were, of keeping their faith alive in a place designed to extinguish it. Sister Magdalena, now the unspoken leader, marked the walls with symbols: a bird for each woman still living, a small flame for each one lost. When a new bird stopped appearing, they knew another had been taken. The guards never found the chapel, but they noticed something had changed. The women no longer seemed afraid. They no longer flinched when the doors opened. They had found something stronger than survival. They had found purpose, and that terrified their captors more than any scream ever could. By 1482, the palace had changed. A new sultan sat on the throne, younger, more ambitious, more determined to erase any trace of weakness left by his predecessors. He ordered a full accounting of every soul within the palace walls: servants, concubines, laborers, slaves. Everyone was to be recorded, documented, made useful or removed. But when the scribes descended into the lower chambers, they found something they couldn't explain. A group of women who existed in the records only as a gap, a blank space. No names, no origins, just a single notation written in faded ink: unfit for service, disposed. But they were still there, still alive, and the scribes didn't know what to do with them. They reported their findings to the Grand Vizier, who consulted with the palace imam, who in turn brought the matter to the Sultan himself, and the decision was made. These women were ghosts. They had already been erased from history, and ghosts, by definition, do not exist, so nothing would change. The chambers would remain sealed, the women would remain forgotten, and the empire would continue as if they had never been. Except the women refused to cooperate with their own erasure. In their hidden chapel, they continued their silent worship. They carved new prayers into the stone. They marked the passing of time with scratches on the wall, one line for each full moon, one cross for each Christmas that passed in the dark. And slowly, over months and years, their chapel became something more than a hiding place. It became a testament, proof that faith could survive where nothing else could. That even in the deepest darkness, light could still be found. A Venetian merchant who visited Constantinople in 1485 wrote in his journal about strange rumors circulating among the palace servants. Stories of women who sang in the night, women who prayed to a god the empire had tried to erase. He dismissed it as superstition, the foolish beliefs of frightened slaves, but he also wrote something else, something he couldn't explain. He claimed that on certain nights, when the wind blew from the north, you could hear faint voices rising from beneath the palace. Voices that sang in Latin, voices that shouldn't exist. Historians ignored his account for centuries, dismissed it as fantasy. But when archaeologists finally excavated beneath the ruins of in the 1970s, they found something that changed everything. A small chamber, hidden behind layers of stone and mortar, and on the walls, carved in rough, uneven letters, were words in Latin, lux in lucet. The light shines in the darkness. Beneath it, dozens of crosses, some large, some barely visible, each one a silent act of defiance. Each one proof that the women had been real, that their faith had been real, that their suffering had not been imaginary. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world, because it meant that everything the Ottoman Empire had tried to bury had survived, not in documents, not in official records, but in the walls themselves. The stone had remembered what the empire had chosen to forget, and suddenly fragments of old stories began to make sense. The whispered rumors, the cryptic journal entries, the gaps in the palace ledgers, they weren't myths. They were echoes of something that had actually happened. Something too shameful to record, too powerful to fully destroy. Inside the hidden chapel, researchers found more than just carvings. They found remnants of makeshift altars, pieces of pottery arranged in deliberate patterns, scraps of cloth that had once been used for prayer. And in one corner, barely legible, a list of names, 22 in total, written in a shaking hand, each name followed by a small mark, some marked with crosses, others with birds, a code only the women themselves would have understood. A way of remembering each other when memory was all they had left. Sister Magdalena's name was there. So was Sister Theodora's, sisters, and 19 others whose stories had been lost to time. But now, carved into stone, they existed again, not as victims, not as forgotten prisoners, but as women who had refused to let their faith die, who had carved their prayers into the walls of their prison and turned suffering into something sacred. The archaeologists who discovered the chapel reported feeling something unusual, a weight in the air. A stillness that seemed almost reverent. One researcher later wrote that standing in that small room felt like standing in the presence of something holy, something that had outlasted empires and centuries and the deliberate cruelty of men who thought they could erase souls with silence. But the chapel wasn't the only thing that survived. In the Ottoman archives in Bursa, a document surfaced in the late 1990s, a letter written by a palace official in 1487. It was brief, almost dismissive. But it confirmed what the carvings had already revealed. It mentioned foreign women, Christian women, who had refused to submit and had been confined beneath the palace. The letter didn't say what happened to them. It didn't need to. The silence was the answer. They had been buried alive, not in earth, but in history, left to die in the dark while the empire above them celebrated its power and glory. And yet they didn't die, not entirely, because centuries later their voices were still being heard. In the journals of travelers, in the whispers of servants, in the carvings on the walls, they had found a way to speak across time, to tell their story even when every record had been destroyed, even when their names had been erased, even when the empire had done everything in its power to make them disappear. They had carved their truth into stone, and stone, unlike empires, does not forget. The last mention of Sister Magdalena comes not from Ottoman records, but from a letter intercepted by Venetian spies in 1490. The letter was written by a low-ranking palace scribe to his brother in. In it, he mentioned something that had disturbed him deeply. He had been sent to inspect the lower chambers for structural damage after heavy rains, and in one of the sealed rooms he heard something he couldn't explain. A woman's voice, singing, weak, barely audible. But unmistakably singing. He didn't open the door, he was too afraid. He simply marked the chamber as stable and left. But the sound stayed with him. He wrote that it was the saddest and most beautiful thing he had ever heard. A voice singing to a god in a language he didn't understand, singing as if death itself was listening. The scribe never went back, and within months that section of the palace was permanently sealed. New walls were built, new floors laid over the old. The chambers beneath were filled with rubble and forgot. If any of the nuns were still alive at that point, they were entombed, buried under stone in silence, left to whatever end awaited them in the dark. The empire moved on, new conquests, new victories, new stories to tell. And the 22 women who had once prayed in a convent on the outskirts of Constantinople became nothing more than a footnote, a gap in a ledger, a rumor whispered by servants who would themselves be forgotten. But something strange began to happen over the following centuries. Palace attendants reported cold spots in certain corridors, rooms that smelled faintly of incense even though no incense had been burned. And on nights when the moon was full, some claimed to hear faint singing rising from beneath the floors, always in Latin, always the same melody, a hymn that no one in the palace recognized but that seemed to carry a weight older than the stones themselves. The Ottoman officials dismissed it as superstition. Tricks of the wind, echoes in old architecture, but the servants knew better. They avoided those corridors, they left offerings of bread and water near the sealed doors, and they whispered prayers of their own, not to Allah, but to the women they believed still lingered below, women who had become something more than human in the retelling, saints, spirits, guardians of a faith that refused to die. European travelers who visited Constantinople in the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally recorded these stories. A French diplomat in 1712 wrote that the older palace staff spoke of Christian women who had sung themselves into heaven, women whose voices could still be heard if you listened carefully on certain nights. He called it a charming local superstition, a quaint tale to entertain foreign guests, but he also noted something peculiar. When he asked to see the lower chambers of the palace, his request was, when he pressed further, he was told that some places were better left undisturbed, that some doors, once sealed, should never be opened. He didn't understand why, but he wrote that the man who told him this looked genuinely afraid. It wasn't until the early 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed, that the truth began to emerge. Archaeologists and historians gained access to areas of the palace that had been off-limits for generations, and what they found beneath the marble and gold was a network of forgotten chambers, storage rooms, dungeons, and in one small corner buried under centuries of debris, the chapel. The carvings were still there, faded but legible, the crosses, the names. The Latin phrase that had survived longer than the empire that tried to erase it, lux in lucet, the light shines in the darkness. Modern researchers who have studied the site say that it's one of the most haunting archaeological discoveries in Ottoman history, not because of what was found, but because of what it represents. 22 women who were stolen from their lives, stripped of their identities, buried alive in the dark, and who, despite everything, managed to keep their faith alive long enough to carve it into stone, long enough to leave a mark that would outlast their captors, long enough to tell their story to a world that had forgotten they ever existed. The chapel is gone now. The palace has changed hands. The stones have been moved and repurposed and scattered across Istanbul, but the carvings were documented, photographed, preserved, and in archives and museums the story of the women beneath endures. Their names are known now: Sister Magdalena, Sister Theodora, Sister, and 19 others whose lives were stolen but whose faith could not be. They didn't defeat the Ottoman Empire, they didn't escape, they didn't survive in any traditional sense, but they did something far more powerful. They refused to be forgot. They carved their truth into stone and trusted that someday someone would find it, someone would listen, someone would remember, and centuries later here we are, telling their story. Honoring their defiance, bearing witness to a faith that survived where nothing else could. There are fates worse than death, and what happened to these women beneath the palace was one of them. But they turned their suffering into something sacred. They transformed their prison into a chapel, and they left behind a message that still resonates today. That faith, real faith, cannot be destroyed by walls or chains or empires, that even in the deepest darkness, light can still shine, and that some voices, no matter how deeply they're buried, will always find a way to be heard. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the cost of faith and the power of defiance, leave a comment below. Tell us what you felt. Tell us what you'll remember. And if you want more stories like this, stories buried in the shadows of history and brought back into the light, subscribe to Master Historians. Because some truths are too powerful to stay buried. Some voices are too strong to be silenced. And some stories, no matter how much time passes, deserve to be told.